Hi, using the V-scale for modern psychosensory practice. It's part of positive psychosensory practice and it's part of brain art and brain sculpture. And I'm Carol Robertson from Psychosensory Academy. You can find me at psychosensoryacademy.com. This is an introduction for professional psychosensory practitioners. And we're going to really explore what you can do with the V-scale. There's lots you can do. So here is the V-scale, seemingly super simple. It's informed by biology and it's informed by our history as prey mammals. And as prey animals, as the neuroscientists say, we're rubbish animals. We're very slow, we've not got great hearing, we've not got claws or big teeth. And so when we respond to stimulus, or in our case when we're in sessions we're using cues, then we're going to respond to that stimulus by wondering if it's risky. That's one side of the V-scale there you see. Or on the other side of the V-scale, is it going to be rewarding? So if it's risky, it could be, it's all your unconditional threat stimuli. It could be a hole in the ground, it could be heights, it could be a panther, it could be a pack of dogs. Because when we were prey mammals in the Stone Age times, and remember we still have that same brain, we were actually the prey of quite small predators like dogs, coyotes, and hyenas. It wasn't just the big cats. And so it was very important for us to be in groups, and it was very important for us to, because we're very vulnerable and our young take a long time to develop in the womb. We have a long pregnancy and they're very vulnerable when they're born, and we're smelly and we're tasty. So we had to find a way to respond to stay safe, and we developed this fantastic sort of recording system, this fantastic predicting system, and we still have that, although we are no longer vulnerable in the same way. So it's also informed by neuroscience. Then we have stimulus and cue again coming up in the middle. And we can think also about pessimism in terms of outlook, and or we can have an optimistic outlook. And if you're a Havener, you'd be really used to the idea of landscape, and you can see how that shaping can change our outlook to be pessimistic or optimistic. And of course there's brain art and brain sculpture, so we can start thinking about how to shape that, and we do that with Havening too. So you can make a change and your outlook can become more optimistic, or changes can happen and you can become more pessimistic. So we can use the V-scale in lots of different ways. I think it's very important, well, it's vital, that the first time somebody meets the V-scale, that they learn about it through thinking about something wonderful that happened, or some everyday thing that happened, like having a lovely cup of tea or something like that, and accessing that and noticing that moment. So it's great to be using the receptors we already have that we've made doing these great times. So this is different from imagining a sort of wonderful fantasy place. This is using the receptors we have for those little moments where we just go, oh, that's really great. Or in this case, this is one for me. So this is the first time I saw a horse who became my pet for many years, for 30 years. But the very first time I saw him was amazing. And so we're going to look at these in depth. This is just a look for you to see the range of using the V-scale. So we introduce it this way so that the learning process, the long-term potentiation that happens when the person learns about the V scale is associated with a really good time and with mapping a wide range of responses. So they're mapping their cognitive, their autonomic system, their somatosensory system, and their emotional system. So if you're a Havener, you'll recognise that as case, and they're able to observe. So it's also QOCTU, so they're questioning, observing, they're calibrating, they're tracking, and they're utilising as they, recall that moment and they access the sensory information. What did they see? What did they hear? What did they feel? What was the weather like? What time of year was it? What time of day was it? What date was it? So they're learning to recall with great accuracy and to QOCTU all that information. And QOCTU is part of brain art and brain sculpture. So again, we're just having an overview at the moment. So the other way that we can use the V scale is we have a way of working with question sets that you'll see later. And those question sets, in a very light way, they balance the history for one thing, like you saw in the last slide, the balancing of the history. So it's not all focused on, frights and difficult times. It also reminds us of the times we felt proud or curious or, excited that we'd learned something. And so when we use those question sets, we also get a view of where the person's placing things, and they get that view too. So this is from an actual case. So you can see here that all of these wonderful things like family and home and reputation were were perceived to be risky at this time in this person's life. This was all risky. And the high risk things were things like career and reputation was at risk, the family home was at risk, and the business was at risk. And then the things that would normally have been on the rewarding side, like relaxing and enjoying your family and having hobbies, you can see that they're on the risky side and they're down at a kind of neutral. So they're not getting any joy from these, they're very sort of flat. And they may have had great joy from them before, but now they've moved to this risky side of the stressful side of the V scale. And if you notice on the rewarding side of the V scale, kind of halfway up, and I think really it would have been all the way up, but the person had come for a session at a time when they realised that, it wasn't really appropriate for the car to be, absolutely the thing that they love. So they placed it about the middle, but on observation I would have said it would have been much further up. But you go with the client's placement and you'll find that they'll move these placements quite often, and that's fine. You've got the flexibility with the V scale to do that. And I think it's a great thing, the openness of the V scale, because it allows people to feel free in saying, actually, I think that that's further up or further down or over there, or now it's moved to here. And that's a wonderful thing, because as you know, these psychosensory processes are so fast. So then the other way that we use the V scale is actually to map the changes that happen in session. So again, this is an actual case, and the person came in, their cue was to do with interactions with people, and they had become very tired and just felt like a volcano. So their word, if you like, would be volcano, but we use the cue of personal interaction. So it was about getting on with people. So it was about people. So if you like, the cue became shortened to people, other people. And the response to that was volcano. After using some havening techniques, the person reported kind of perceiving themselves more. They're obviously accessing quite a lot of information, but their way of describing it and their way of mapping it on the V scale was to say they were a bit prickly, a bit like a porcupine. and so that's placed there. And you can see it's lower, and they've chosen a much less vibrant colour. It's altogether quieter. And then after doing some more, I think they did some event havening, and so after doing some working memory activities, they had a completely new perception and were kind of doubting that they really were this sort of volcanic, prickly sort of person. They're beginning, I think, to remember times when they were much more social. So they were, as they said, they were chucking some ideas in the bin. So there they are, chucking some ideas in the bin. So some sort of shifts are happening. They're still aware that they kind of think of themselves as a volcano and a porcupine, and they want to kind of, they might sort of have blown up, but they're doubting that now. It doesn't seem so possible. So back we go to doing more working memory activities and doing Havening Touch, and they move to suddenly saying that they have, well, they feel it's really sudden, but actually we had that doubt creeping in further back, didn't we? So they say, oh, I've got all these new insights, and then they kind of are in a wee bit like a bit ashamed and a bit guilty, and see that they have a kind of part to play in it as well, and quite a lot of insights. So then we work through maybe doing some outcome havening around about the metaphors, or some role havening, or some informational, maybe some hopeful havening, and move forward from there. And then the person talks about recognizing all of these connections between themselves and other people. Then we do a bit more using havening techniques, and they talk about feeling love for others and feeling full of love and loving themselves. And they're laughing really because they're like, I'm not really a volcano at all. So they've got a new metaphor for themselves, new responses, and obviously as Haveners we know that depotentiation has occurred and potentiation has happened. So we will look at this in detail later on, and there's also mini courses that you can go on if you want to learn more how to use this elegant way of mapping. And the other thing to think about is that love heart there that we see at the top of the powerful responses. When they encountered the Q again, which was getting on with others, their response was this heartfelt, warm feeling. So when they go off to live their life and leave the session, the stimuli that they come across that was generating the volcano will now be generating this warmer, what they called a heartfelt approach. And also when they cue it themselves when they think about it. So they had lots of, in their head they were thinking, oh, other people, oh, I'm a volcano, I don't like them, I'm prickly, I protect myself like a porcupine. Those cues, not only are they not using them in the same way, but the cues are not going to generate that kind of the previous response. Then we can also use the V scale to map progressive changes. So if we look at it here, what's happened is the V scale at the end where we see that line, that's like a V scale opened up. And the base of the V, if you like, is where it says objective responses. And you see at the top there's powerful responses, and at the bottom there's powerful responses. So it's a V flattened out. And then we have a kind of, we can see, when an Emily took place. So that first Emily, this is from quite a young girl. So her first Emily there was her hamster dying. The high elves here that we see was a particularly fantastic birthday. And then this elf here was getting another hamster and being happy about it, but also being aware of it was a bit affected by this one because she felt a bit guilty. So she had originally been really happy with her first hamster, but this is a reduced elf, isn't it? It's not way up here because it's impacted by this experience of this Emily. And then this Emily here, which should say Emily in it, was the death of her grandmother. So it was very important, Emily, for her. And then after havening, and she mapped her map again, which she really enjoyed doing, she was very excited that this Emily, when she recalled it, mapped as a 0, because she had an objective response to this now. And these were still the same, because these are things that happened in history. So she didn't make this one bigger, interestingly. It stayed the same size, but later on there were some things that she particularly liked about the hamster and had high peaks. And then this Emily here, which was about the death of her grandmother, you can see it's much reduced. So, it had been, a very powerful response, and now it's a much lesser response. So then there'd be a bit more havening done, and that would be flat. But even as a young girl, she was absolutely thrilled to have this graphic representation that her response to this had changed. So it's the response that changed. She still remembers what happened, but her responding is different. So that's mapping progressive change. So you can see there's a lot that you can do with it. So let's explore a bit more. So a bit of background really. So modern psychosensory practice. So the psychosensory practitioner can use the V-scale to change the traditional frame and the supports to the move to a modern approach. What does that mean? So let's see. So the use of the V-scale can help with the transition towards, let's ditch the frame. Sometimes when we learn something new, we have to throw out some of our old ideas and modernise. It really helps us to engage as an educator, and that's different from providing treatments as a healer, therapist, fixer or guru. It's much more about sharing. It can help us recognise dramatic arcs and our own risk bias, when we've got trauma goggles on, or the client's got trauma goggles on, and it helps us take action. So for example, we're using structures, we're using processes, we're using terminology that's different. We're talking about cues, not triggers. We're considering reward as well as risk responses. So we've got a balanced history, and we're using cues that activate helpful responses. And we're helping the client update their frames of reference about their experiences. So they're using the V-scale, and that's helping them think about receptors being activated by cues and their responses being completely normal responses of how mammals, humans function. So they're learning that they have neuroplasticity and that they have no, some of their older beliefs might have been that they have demons. So they learn that there are no demons, there are no parts, there are no inner children, there are no struggles, there's no trauma, and there's no wounds in their brain. When we're, it's not that they've had an injury in their brain. So yeah, as I touched on before, we're balancing the history. So the V-scale really helps us think about that balance. So we're noticing and measuring a range of cues and responses rather than just focusing on, for instance, ACEs. And we're sharing information about using cues and responses, because once we know what cues are useful for us, we can actually start to utilise them. And we're sharing about neuroplasticity and psychosensory approaches, which are wonderful because people can use them themselves. And we're learning how to use modern terminology. So we're talking about long-term potentiation, we're talking about long-term depression, LTP and LTD, how receptors are potentiated, how receptors are depotentiated. Talk about receptors, traffic flow, neural traffic flow, cues, sensory matching and responses. And much of the mystery of unwanted responses falls away, and the person feels real relief, and there's a real release from many fears. And so supporting the client's growing control of their continued progression. So adding to their skill base as they study. So giving them that control. So it becomes truly client-led through them being educated in how to do it and what skills to develop. So what's positive psychosensory practice? So mapping can be used to support positive psychosensory practice. The V scale soon becomes used mentally, soon becomes something that you have in your head. We start off with it as, a paper V scale or a digital V scale, but then you can just use it in your head and it's easy to access. So clients can use it so many different ways, as we saw, but here's another run through. So it helps them recognise where they're currently placing their attention and how they're responding to cues. It helps them observing which cues they're routinely using and questioning whether they're helpful or not. Valuing the responses to cues and becoming more aware of their own risk bias, trauma goggles and dramatic arcs. Mapping their experiences of fast change, which increases clarity and reduces apexing. So you'll see when we have that record of what it was like at the start and how they accessed, it's really useful to have that record as you progress, because it gives you a really strong visual that something is happening, and having the sharing the science of what's happening and explaining it in terms of receptors being absorbed and new receptors being used or new receptors being made gives people a very safe way of accessing that information. They're not thinking that they're going back to the event. We can't go back to an event. We have receptors that we're activating. So, mapping progression. And they are directing the changes. It's deliberate depotentiation in some cases, or deliberate potentiation in some cases. Providing a structure for considering future directed changes. Updating their frames of references about their experiences. And that's especially important when people are perhaps fearful of their own autonomic responses or their cognitive responses, if they're scared of accessing images and they think it's random, whereas in fact it's actually being cued by sensory matching or by something they're saying to themselves, or a date or a time or a scent. And so suddenly having that understanding is a great release from fear. Same with internal dialogue and somatosensory experience also, which is often described as metaphors. And recognising that they're creative, that we collage, we don't have fixed memories really. In actual fact, we make collages all the time, and that what we were looking at in terms of pessimism and optimism plays a part in that, how we collage, where we put our focus. And we can make brain art. We do make brain art, and we do brain sculpture all the time. So actually engaging in it and directing it is quite a change for people. So some useful context. Principle 1. A cue or a stimulus activates receptors which were made before. Neural traffic flows through those receptors and we have responses. We respond to that. We then notice our responses and we're actually cued by our responses. And then we go onward from there. So it's like a loop, isn't it? But it's the set of loops. Because the end cue is different from the first cue. And if we're scared of our responses, then you can imagine where that goes. But if we're curious about our responses, it's going to go quite differently. And our response, our electrochemical response, and the neurochemicals and hormones that we make are going to be very different in a flash, so quickly. So where we place our attention is generally directed by responses to cues. And we're usually unaware that we're responding to a cue. It's, like you see in that top line, we tend to notice our responses. We don't notice the sequence before it. Our responses to cues alter after using psychosensory processes. So rather than looking for the space between stimuli and response, it's more like looking at, I'm responding this way to this cue, or I'm cueing myself in this way and making changes so the response to the cue changes. So we change it and then explore how our responses are and then work on from there. So let's have a wee look at what cues are. So cues can be external, so that's all your sensory input that we transduce electrically, so it's everything round about us. And cues can be internal, so they can be body functioning and sensations, and they can also be thoughts. And what are responses? So we looked at how it's to do with perceptions, risky or rewarding. We looked at how it relates to our outlook, which is shaped by our landscape, so it can be pessimistic or optimistic. And it's also related to recalling, predicting and imagining. It's related to learning, LTP and LTD, and to do with taking action. To a range of different responses. Is it risky or is it rewarding? Principle 2. Accurately measuring as many responses as possible is key to safe and elegant psychosensory practice. So, when measuring responses to cues in everyday life, at the starting point of using a process, during the process, immediately after using the process, and afterwards in everyday life. And what are we measuring? We're measuring responses such as immunity, thoughts, beliefs and explanations, autonomic changes, survival or eat and digest, and internal sensations, and also emotional. And there's a lot of science looking at emotional responses as being communications, both to ourselves, like calming signals, and to other people, like communication signals. Lots of rabbit holes to go down. Principles 3 to 7. Being able to question, observe, calibrate, track and utilise responses. That's QOCTU. And we do that with everything. It's really important for safe and elegant psychosensory practice. So these are skills that you want to develop and you want to help the client develop. Being able to map a wide range of responses during a session is really valuable. Being able to balance the history and map many changes is helpful. And when a person can QOCTU well, when they can question, observe, calibrate, track and utilise, using psychosensory processes becomes comfortable and easy. And I'd say it makes it very safe. Explore and develop key skills before using psychosensory practice, before using psychosensory processes. And I think that's really, really important. So rather than diving in, you explore what people know already, what their skills are, and help develop some key skills. And I use a framework of saying to the client to test it out so they can give it a really good test and they know themselves how effective the process has been. And so they can tweak it. So for instance, they understand they're using a working memory activity and they'll notice if they're starting to move to long-term memory, or they'll notice if they're becoming shy about getting jammed. So it's really helpful to know what we're doing and we can finally share that. Psychosensory processes will give us that, and it's really a new thing. Okay, so let's do some. It's a great way to learn by experience.